Hello, class. Welcome back. Last time we were talking about the Reformation. We talked about the Reformation under Luther and under Calvin. We also talked about the changes that are going on in the world, um, the rise of the nation state, the rise of science, scholarship. What happens after the Reformation is going to be about 100 years of war, and it's war between Catholics and Protestants. So we'll call this the Wars of Religion. And it usually occurs because a nation takes the identity of either Catholic or Protestant, and these nations are also going out into the world and colonizing different parts of the world. So colonialism is going on at this time. So the nation wants wealth and power, and it aligns itself with religion. And so sometimes the people who go and colonize other places in the world, like the New World here, there are religious people who go for religious reasons. There are people who go for reasons for power and wealth. So there are mixed motives in colonialism. But what it does is it increases the power of the state, wealth and power of the state. So Spain first goes to the Latin America and the New World. France is Catholic, Spain is Catholic, Germany, Prussia, Lutheran, Geneva, Switzerland is Calvinist. England has a hard time. It goes from Catholic to Protestant, Catholic and Protestant until they become the Church of England, which is kind of Catholic in church hierarchical order and Protestant in church teaching theology. So it's kind of a halfway. But they do have wars of religion in England. This is where the Puritans, particularly, are persecuted, and they flee to the New World. And so we have the Pilgrims who come first. Actually, Catholics go to Jamestown first. The Puritans come after the Pilgrims, and they begin to start colonies. And the colonies, again, are families, religious families that rule themselves politically, but it was meant to be small. But as soon as they get to the New World, there are divisions. And so we'll see the Baptists come out of this. There's an Anabaptist movement in Europe, but we see Baptists come to the New World. So we have Puritans, Catholics, Baptists, and division in the church. Catholics and Protestants war against each other for 100 years. Out of this comes the modern period. So 1649 is when the Westminster Confession of Faith is codified. This is a document that is meant for the Protestant churches. It was commissioned in England at the Westminster Abbey, and it was all these different leaders in Protestantism who met for a long time and hashed out this doctrine. And it's the summary of the Reformation teachings. Right around the time that this project is complete, they write the Westminster Confession, the Shorter Catechism, the Larger Catechism, and several documents. And that becomes the official teachings of the Presbyterian churches. The Baptists, Reformed Baptists, modify it into something called the London Confession. Anyways, this becomes influential doctrine, but it doesn't really take hold because right around the time that it is completed, the Treaty of Westphalia is signed. And this is the Peace of Westphalia. This is where there's not going to be religious war anymore. Each nation is free to be whatever religion the leader says they are. And This is also the beginning of the modern period, the modern world in philosophy in particular. Now, what was going on between, let's say, Calvin and 1650 was what's called scholasticism. Scholasticism actually goes back to what's happening with Thomas Aquinas and Catholicism. The scholastics were studying. They were the intellectuals. They were studying philosophy and logic and proving God exists and stuff. And I think they're fascinating, but there were Protestant scholastics as well. They got into really pedantic, nitpicky things, and people were turned off, particularly the modern philosophers. This is like, copy these sentences and logic. And it was really cumbersome and boring. It seemed like dead, spiritually dead. So the modern period said, let's get away from that. Let's reject it. The modern period decided, you know what, we've had these wars of religion, we've had scholasticism, we've had religion for like 1,000 years. Let's do something different. And they turn away from religion. And it's gradual. Descartes is the father of modern philosophy. He's also very interested in mathematics and science. So the modern turn is towards this world. We already saw that happening with the humanists. We already see problems with William of Ockham saying we can't really know God through the world. We can only know God through Scripture. So there's a rise in fideism, faithism. This turns off the philosophers big time. They become skeptics, skepticism. Nobody could really know for sure. And it's a gradual process, but it begins with the philosophers of the modern period, Descartes, Locke. So Descartes is a rationalist, and he brings philosophy into skepticism through his rationalism. John Locke is an empiricist. All of our knowledge is through the senses. He brings philosophy into skepticism through empiricism. In the outworking of those views, David Hume is a philosopher his father was a Scottish Presbyterian. Hume was raised with the most serious versions of religion, and he turned away. He gave arguments against God. So he showed where the traditional proofs for God that the scholastics have given were flawed. And he brought great skepticism in philosophy, and this causes a turn towards fideism in the church. After Hume, Immanuel Kant is a philosopher who also, he was Lutheran, raised Lutheran, very pietistic. The Lutherans had this pietistic turn where they focused on their inner life and being a good person and doing your duty. Became personal religion. Me and Jesus, the original, that one. So Kant saw this problem of skepticism, and he saw that it was a problem for religion. And so he decides to bridge the gap between rationalism and empiricism. And he said, okay, here's the deal. Our senses know this world, the phenomenal world. Our senses don't know God, the noumenal realm. And so we have to have faith in things like God, the soul, the afterlife. So he's kind of the one that brings fideism to the forefront for modern Christianity. So faith is believing what you can't know. So that's part of the Enlightenment and rationalism that comes out of that Enlightenment. It influences the church through higher criticism, which is a method for studying the sources of Scripture. So the modern university has a naturalistic turn. Let's get away from anything religious. John Locke writes a letter of toleration, it's called. He's a philosopher. The letter of toleration basically sets into motion the separation of church and state and the privatization of religion. Basically, he says, look, we've been warring over religion for the past 100 years. Let's do this. since doctrine divides people, let's keep our faith private. And when we're in the public sphere, let's not express our religion. So he brings in this privatization of religion. This separation of church and state affects the university, and the university takes a naturalistic turn. And it also takes a scientific turn. So scientism is where science becomes a worldview in and of itself. And it's secular. So we have the rise of secularism. Remember, secularism is the process by which common ground between people in terms of religion is lost, because not only is there division in the church, but now there's division between believers and unbelievers. So secularization is the way our language with one another changes and becomes more focused on this world, because this world is the world of science, and science is something we have in common. We don't have religion in common, so that becomes dominant. Naturalism is the view that all that exists is nature. That becomes dominant in this modern period. It's with us now still. Now, as time goes on, philosophers take this skepticism that David Hume saw with empiricism to the limit. So Friedrich Nietzsche, also raised Lutheran, turns away from God and turns against God, and says that God is dead in his day. God is dead and we killed him. Meaning, by the time of Nietzsche, he dies in 1900, by the time of Nietzsche, God is irrelevant. There may be religious people, but God doesn't really influence culture anymore. So Nietzsche, he mentions this reality, God is dead and we killed him, and that brings on the death of God movement. The death of God movement is that God doesn't exist and we are on our own in the cosmos. We're alone. And there's no ultimate meaning. There is no meaning. Nietzsche proposed the revaluation of values, meaning all of these Christian and Platonic and Aristotelian values that the West has accumulated, they're all false. So we need to get rid of them and make new values. Now, he proposed new values were that of the Superman, the man who can will himself to be, but he also suggested that those new values had to be willed upon society. So we had 100 years of the wars of religion. We're about to have 100 years of the wars of secular wars. Nietzsche says that if we throw off these old values, really bad things would come, like very bad wars. And very bad wars did come because in Germany, now you can trace the Reformation and the philosophy in Germany from William of Ockham to Hitler and the Nazi death camps. There's a line, and it's when you get to this kind of nihilism with Nietzsche, they take it as a super race, not just a superman, a super race. And they take this doctrine of evolution and say, hey, if there's this natural evolution, survival of the fittest, why don't we just help it out a little bit and kill the weak? So it's a very ugly, bad point in Western history, and it's an outworking of the philosophy and the religion and seeing what happens with nihilism. So existentialism is a movement in French philosophy after Nietzsche. He can be considered the grandfather of existentialism. Existentialism recognizes there is no meaning in the world. That's true. We're kind of lost in the cosmos, but we can create our own meaning. So it's a way of dealing with the meaninglessness after the death of God. And postmodernism is building on German and French philosophy and continuing that project of the revaluation of values. This comes through deconstruction. Let's deconstruct the old values and get rid of them, root them out. Let's expose them and get rid of them. So those are some of the things that have gone on after the Reformation, following the modern philosophers into the postmodern moment where we are now. I think we're still in the postmodern time. You can think of the postmodern period as after modernism, after it plays itself out, and it's a transition into something else. I don't know what comes after this, but something else comes after this. Now, in the United States, in the 1920s, okay, I should back up. In 1859, I believe Charles Darwin, who's a British naturalist, publishes The Origin of the Species, which is a naturalistic account of the origin and development of humans and human nature. No reference to God at all. So Darwin in England, Karl Marx in Germany and England, Sigmund Freud, is he German? And Friedrich Nietzsche all provide elements of the naturalistic worldview that we've inherited. Now in the United States, the theory of evolution is banned from the public classroom. And so we have this creation versus evolution controversy in the United States going back to the 1920s, when there was a court case called the Scopes Trial. The Scopes Trial was where a man tried to teach evolution in class, and he got sued. Now, I think he lost the lawsuit against the Christian lawyer who was saying this is illegal, but he won the public opinion. And so after this, you can't really, you have to be neutral in how you teach origins. And we haven't settled this debate. Should we teach biology from a creationist perspective or an evolution perspective? We do evolution, but people still fight about this, right? And it brought about a bigger dispute between science and religion. Science is, what's empirically verifiable. Religion is based on faith. We can't agree on that, so we shouldn't teach that in the secular school because it's not common ground. So there's a question of common ground. The higher criticism I mentioned earlier influences liberal Christianity. Here's what happens. They start to use naturalistic ways of studying the scriptures, and they say, well, what if these are just of human origin, and we can trace the authors, and we can trace the influences, and we can explain the origin and existence of scripture just in terms of human authors. That throws a lot of people into doubt about the scriptures and the reliability of the scriptures, and liberal Christianity is accepting that, and maybe accepting some of the naturalistic assumptions coming down through existentialism and postmodernism, and Christianity becomes more of a social phenomenon, like the social gospel. So there's a division between liberal and conservative Christians. And fundamentalism is a direct response to the creation evolution controversy and liberal Christianity. So fundamentalism, and I think I have written down here, I do somewhere, give me just a moment, the 5 fundamentals. So what happened was these teachings came from Europe. The Christians in America, particularly the people influenced by the Puritans, started universities. As soon as they got here, they started Harvard, they started Yale, they started Princeton, and those institutions were teaching conservative Christianity. So they only had, let's say, a BA level of teaching. So if you wanted to get a PhD, you had to go to Europe to get the PhD. So people who wanted to be scholars in the United States let's say from 1650s to 1880s. 1880s, I think, is when the research universities begin. You have to go to Europe to get your higher degree. Well, when they go to Europe, they get influenced by these teachings of Darwin, Marx, Freud, and then later Nietzsche and others. And they become skeptical. And the fundamentalists are the intellectuals who are running some of the seminaries, like Princeton Theological Seminary. They want to combat that teaching that they're getting from Europe. And part of it is there are certain fundamentals in Christianity that you have to affirm in order to be a Christian. And it's some of the stuff that was in the Apostles' Creed. So they come up with these 5 fundamentals, and I'll tell you what they are. And you can see, are these also in the Apostles' Creed? These are things that were being denied. One is the virgin birth of Christ. So remember, the Apostles' Creed affirms that. The deity of Christ, that he's the Son of God. He's not just a good human teacher. That Jesus died on the cross, and his blood is what atones for the sin of humans. So blood atonement. The resurrection of Christ, that he didn't just die and was stolen and hidden somewhere. He died and he resurrected, and he went to sit at the right hand of God, and he will come again. So the second coming. So these are the 5 fundamentals, and the fundamentalist movement begins with affirming those fundamentals. Now it becomes something else. It becomes something kind of ingrown and afraid of ideas. It becomes anti-intellectual, afraid to engage these challenging views that are coming from Europe. And so this also contributes to the fideistic turn in the church, which we're still suffering from today. And anti-intellectualism, fideism, and inability to engage with ideas, particularly the ideas of the philosophers and the scientists from Europe. Now, the church in the United States is contracting right now. It's shrinking, mostly because the millennials and Generation Z don't find it attractive. And I think it's because of the effects of this fundamentalism that I just mentioned. The young people have questions, and the questions aren't being answered by the intellectuals. And are there any intellectuals? So they turn away. But Christianity outside the United States is growing. So it's a worldwide religion, and it's growing in Africa. It's growing in Latin America. It's growing in some of the former Baltic states. So Christianity is not dead. It's just dying in the United States and in Europe, big time. And guess what's growing in Europe? Islam. And we can talk about that in our next unit. So now we have one last piece to talk about in Christianity, and that's denominationalism. A lot of students wonder, why are there so many different denominations? And now we have non-denominational churches. This comes out of the Reformation and the splits that occur. So doctrinal divisions. When they depart from the historic teachings, and remember we have a historic religion, when they depart from historic teachings, they differ over other secondary items. So you have Lutherans and Calvinists and Baptists and Church of England Anglicans, and they continue to split and split and split. And this is another reason people are turned off to Christianity. It's because of the disunity. Remember, Jesus prayed that the church would be one, that the world would believe. You can see a connection here. If the church is so divided, why should we join it? So Christianity has internal challenges now, division, and external challenges, other world religions, and particularly the secular worldview in the West. All right, so this wraps up our discussion of Christianity. What did we cover? We just covered the eras, major eras of church history, starting with the church and empire, the Roman Empire, church in the Middle Ages. We talked about the Renaissance a little bit and the Reformation, and then Christianity in the modern world. Now notice this is a summary. We could go into a lot more detail. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, pick up a book. There's a nice little book called The Story of Christianity by Justo Gonzalez. He's a Latin American guy. He may even not even be American, but he writes this book to tell this entire history, and it's written for a college level audience. It's a good book. He also writes a book called I think it's just Christian Thought, 3-volume series. So if you're interested in this history, I encourage you to read up on it. It's fascinating. All right, I'm going to pause here, and I'll see you in the next unit.